Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Regina Cheney. I am the Community Outreach and Engagement Specialist here at Home of VA. HOME, which stands for Housing Opportunities Made Equal, is a private nonprofit fair housing and civil rights organization. Our mission is to ensure equal access to housing for all people, and we've been doing this work for a little more than 53 years. We thank you for joining us for this morning's discussion on the intersection of evictions and fair housing. Before we begin our discussion, a few things to mention. This session is being recorded. All participants are on mute and not on camera. Please submit your questions in the Q&A feature or raise your virtual hand during Q&A, and we will unmute you. And it will only be your audio and not your video. And if needed, please use the automated closed captions. Our panelists today are Laura Dobbs, Senta Leslie, and Jordan Crothamel. I'll talk a little bit about our panelists first before we get into our discussion, give you their bios. Laura Dobbs is HOME's Director of Policy. Laura advocates for state and local policies to dismantle housing discrimination and expand housing choice. Prior to joining HOME, Laura was the Deputy Director of the Center for Housing Advocacy at Virginia Poverty Law Center. There, she advocated for systemic change for low-income residents through policy, advocacy, and litigation. Laura started her career as a voting rights attorney in Durham, North Carolina, where she connected with voting advocates and communities across the South to preserve and advance equal access to the ballot and fair maps. She earned her JD from William and Mary Law School and BA in Industrial Design from North Carolina State University College of Design. Senta Leslie has worked in the field of affordable housing and homelessness for more than 20 years. She currently serves as the Associate Director of Eviction Prevention for the Commonwealth of Virginia at the Department of Housing and Community Development, DHCD. Prior to joining DHCD, her roles as in our sector included serving as the executive director of the Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless, where she led statewide policy, community organizing, and strategic communication efforts. She has also served as the program developer for Amherst H. Wilder Foundation's Supportive Housing Division, which serves approximately 30% of the homeless families in St. Paul, Minnesota. As a girl, Senta's family used many of the programs that she has spent her career strengthening and protecting. Jordan Crothamel is the program manager for the Virginia Eviction Reduction Pilot at 4Kids, Inc. It's a program focused on providing community-based housing clinics, case management and counseling, and direct financial assistance to tenants facing eviction in Chesapeake and Portsmouth to prevent loss of housing and give tools to avert housing issues moving forward. Jordan and his team launched a project at 4Kids in April 2023 and served over 200 families in the program's first 9 months. Jordan also serves as a member of the Norfolk Eviction Mitigation Team as data committee. He has worked in various roles at 4Kids, seeking to ensure that neighbors facing housing insecurity are not left behind. Jordan is also a member of YIMBY Hampton Roads and serves on the DEI and staff inclusion teams at 4Kids to ensure that all voices are heard and highlighted. He is passionate about both legislative advocacy and ground level solutions to make sure that there is affordable and available housing to all Hampton Roads residents and beyond. So this morning we have a few, we're going to start with, I think, Laura, you're going to have some slides first? Okay. And then we'll sort of go in to the discussion, which the first one is, of course, how do we define evictions? So, Laura.
Sure, thanks, Regina. Just to get started, I have an echo. You can mute yourself, Regina.
Let's see.
Okay, I think that fixed it. So just to do some level setting about what are we talking about when we talk about evictions. And it gets defined a few different ways, but I choose to use a broader definition as evictions being involuntary moves that are initiated by property owners or managers of rental housing. And the reason I do that is evictions don't always happen just through a formal court process. That's often the most common form of, if you're going through the court process, it being for not paying rent or other lease violations, but they also happen through other proceedings outside of the court. Some of those might be illegal by driving out tenants, by stopping repairs, harassment, or a tenant's lack of knowledge or trust in the system. But they also happen through things like non-renewal, or if the rent is increasing to a point that a person can't afford it. So for every formal eviction, so when you see that court filing, there are additional 2 to 5 forced renter moves through things like, not renewing the lease, or if the rent increases beyond a point that a tenant can't afford it. So this chart here is from the Census Bureau's American Housing Survey that tries to get a sense of how often renters are forced out of their housing and the reason for that. And as you see, those informal evictions account for a vast majority of what we see. Even through the formal eviction process, with non-payment being the number one reason we see people going through the court, we see people who move out as soon as they receive that summons for unlawful detainer, which is that formal court paper from the court. We also see people move in between the filing and before judgment is entered, or they might wait through the whole thing until a sheriff actually comes to enforce that eviction judgment. Unfortunately, we have a little bit limitations on the data, so I'm going to be relying on those court filings and court judgments to have a sense of what evictions look like here in Virginia. I have to shout out the RV Eviction Lab for sharing some of their slides and data. They do a lot of research on evictions in Virginia to help us better understand the problem so that we can also better put together policy interventions to stop it, as well as intervention methods to help families who are going through a difficult time. So what this chart is showing, that orange bar is the number of filings. So that's when the landlord is filing a lawsuit against the tenant to remove them. And that brown bar is the actual judgments. And the dotted lines is trying to show how that compares to where we were before the pandemic. As you can see, there's oftentimes a huge difference between filings and judgments. And some of the questions that we look at, we're trying to figure out is like, why is there such a big difference between filings and judgments? That could be due to a number of reasons. It can be because the tenant is able to catch up and pay what they owe before that judgment is entered, or the landlord dismisses the case for whatever reason. And so, what do evictions look like now that the pandemic protections have ended? Well, as you see, we're not quite up to where we were prior to the pandemic, but we're getting pretty close. And I think this chart is also showing that good policy interventions do have a huge impact on evictions. So where you see this really sharp dip down, that was in March of 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic started and the courts were physically closed. So landlords could not go into court to file an eviction or get judgment. And then throughout that summer, the court system repeatedly extended its own moratorium, recognizing that having people forced out of their homes during a health crisis would just make things worse. But once the court started hearing eviction cases again, we saw a bit of an uptick. But then Virginia really led the nation in rolling out a rent relief program to provide people those rental assistance payments to help them stay in the property. And the Virginia General Assembly passed really important protections to ensure that people could stay in their home. One of those being that the landlord would have to apply for rent relief on behalf of the tenant before they could remove them from the property. So we saw that work for a number of years. And once those protections ended in the summer of 2022, we saw a pretty sharp uptick in the eviction rates, but not quite what they were prior to the pandemic. So how does Virginia compare to other states? We don't have data for every state in the country, but we're still higher than a lot of other states. Across Virginia, we're at a filing rate of about 13%. And that filing rate is based on the number of eviction filings per 100 renter households. So comparing raw numbers of filings with the total population. So 13% is pretty high compared to, like, if you're looking at, say, Connecticut, which is 4%, or Delaware, 12%, Indiana, 9%. But if we're looking just within Virginia, how are we doing? On the left, I have it ranked by the top 5 localities based on the number of filings since March of 2020. Based on these numbers, it looked like Norfolk is not doing so great with the number of filings. But on the right, I have it sorted by the filing rate. So based on the population size, how often are we seeing families get evicted against? And that ranking looks a little bit different. So even though, Petersburg has relatively few filings compared to Norfolk, based on their population size, they have a much higher filing rate at 32%, which is just abhorrent. Not that Norfolk is doing really great. They're at about 18%, but this just gives you an idea of where we are in Virginia with our eviction filings, eviction rates. And then the right-hand column in each of these charts is showing the number of filings in March of this year. I don't have the totals for April or May yet, but that's what it is for March. So what do we know about how much people are getting evicted for? And I think this is important to better understand and better craft what our intervention policies are. So one way to figure that out is comparing what is the median gross rent for that area compared to the principal amount owed in an eviction filing. That principal amount owed typically is going to be the amount of rent that the tenant is owed, and they might owe additional attorney's fees and court costs and filing fees on top of that principal amount. So if we're looking at the Hampton Roads, Newport News, Norfolk area, the median gross rent is $1,229 compared to the median principal owed is about $1,800. So what does that tell us? It's about 1.5 months of rent for the area. If you think about the eviction process and how the time it takes to get into court, seeing that median number of rents owed be 1.5 months is an indication that we're seeing a lot of people getting sued for 1 month's rent. Landlords are allowed, when they file that eviction lawsuit, to ask for the amount that the tenant is in arrears, as well as any rent that tenant is going to owe when they get to court. So if it takes a couple weeks to get into court, they're going to owe not only that month's rent, but maybe half a month's rent by the time they get to court, if they haven't paid anything yet. So 1.5 months rent shows that oftentimes people are getting sued owing 1 month's rent, compared to the Northern Virginia area, that even though they have higher gross rent, they have a much higher median principal amount owed, which is about 2 months rent. So landlords there are waiting longer before they file a lawsuit against a tenant. It could be indication that they're, willing to work with the tenant before they file that eviction lawsuit, or waiting till they're really far behind before they sue them. as opposed to a landlord in other areas of state that are filing an eviction lawsuit every single month that the tenant is late. Something else we've seen a jump in the amount of those eviction judgments correlates to an increase in the amount of rents across the state. So about 40% of Virginians reported rent increases higher than inflation. And that's not seen disproportionately based on demographics. 54% of Black renters report increases higher than inflation compared to just 35% for white renters. And we've seen, that amount of rent increase also increase. So if you look at 2021, this yellow is someone who had an increase of less than $100. The orange is they had a rent increase of $100 to $250. So in 2022 and 2023, the amount of those increases year over year has also gone up. I think it's pretty astounding to see, these dark oranges where people's rent has gone up anywhere from $250 to $500. That is just unattainable for most people. We're not seeing people's incomes go up quite that quickly. And I think this really leads us into some of the discussion topics we're going to have later about who do we know is getting evicted? We know that the most common age to be threatened with eviction is between birth and 19 years old. So evictions are primarily harming families and primarily Black families. Black Americans make up about 19% of all renters, but they account for about 51% of those threatened with eviction. So just think about that, that massive disparity, and particularly on children. For Black children age 0 to 4, 12% were threatened with eviction. And we also are seeing an uptick in renters above the age of 65 who are facing eviction every year. And this chart really displays those massive disparities among racial demographics, but also whether or not a child is present in the home. So the two single biggest predictors of whether or not someone is going to face eviction is based on race and whether or not there is a child in the home, particularly if there's a young child in the home. So that's level setting of where we are in Virginia. If you want to learn a bit more, dig into the data a little bit more, we have a page up on our website. We have a beta version now. We're hoping to launch a slightly tidier version soon, but you can go to homofva.org/VA eviction crisis if you're interested in this data, want to engage a bit more, as well as follow along with Home to see what some of our policy solutions are to the eviction crisis. And I'll leave this up for just a few moments and transition back to Regina, and then I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Laura. So we'll go into sort of our panel discussion now. And this question will be for all panelists. What are the harms of evictions? We can start with you, Jordan.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, I mean, in its essence, right, eviction is harmful. It's a stressful situation. It's a situation where you're already coming in and you are already in a place of financial distress, right? You've missed a paycheck. You have had some conversation with your landlord that was likely unpleasant. There was something that was happening that was harmful, number one, to your mental health, right? Like you're going through this stressful situation, but then now as you enter that eviction process, you're starting to unlock this kind of whole new cycle of harm, right? Which is that not only are you going to have this immediate situation, which is uncomfortable or which is harmful, but you now are starting a process of a history. You're kind of starting a history, you're already involved in a history of where this eviction filing and where this paperwork is going to follow you, right? And so this from a simple housing standpoint, right? Before we get into kind of, and I think Cinta can speak really well too to some of the effects on childhood and some other things, but just from a simple housing standpoint, this eviction will follow you They typically show up on credit reports 6 to 7 years. I've seen them much past that. But we also have a free online court case filing situation in Virginia. And so that website can be pulled up by anyone, including anybody on this call, but also including landlords, private or public. Tenant screening is going to pull those filings as well as you apply for new places. So you've got this harm that's following you. It's kind of like a scarlet letter. Anytime you go for a new place, if you do end up losing this place, they're going to see that you have in the past not had the ability to pay your rent. And so that's going to harm you. It's going to force you into lower quality housing. It's going to force you into housing that can be more selective at times and charge more upfront, right? Because those double deposits, that's common if you have any kind of credit harm. Extra risk factors, what they're going to say is like, hey, we need maybe another month of rent. You know, some of those things when you're trying to get into that new housing, it's really going to follow you. But the harm of that filing, even if there's no eviction, right? Kind of like Laura was speaking to, even if there's not a possession on your record that comes from that case, that harm is going to stay with you for a very, very long time. And it is going to show up as you try and move on and get in there. And then we start to get into kids missing school, doctors' appointments being missed, people missing work, losing jobs. That kind of leads to another vicious cycle, which I'll throw it back because I think some of the other panelists can probably speak to that a little better than I can as well.
Yeah, Jordan, that was so well said. And maybe I'll just sort of take an even higher altitude level on that. You know, I say all the time, where we live impacts everything, every aspect of our lives. You know, home is where children can learn. It's what allows our workers to earn. Laura talked about the older folks who are experiencing filings and evictions more often. You know, home allows our seniors to age in place, and the impact goes way beyond individual households, right? It impacts our entire community. So that includes our local economies. I want to underscore what Laura and Jordan have both said, that a filing is just as damaging as an actual executed eviction. With the filing comes challenges around access to future housing, as Jordan already laid out. Data shows us that SNAP, so food benefits and other mainstream benefits, take an absolute like 90-degree nosedive after someone is displaced from their home. It impacts kids' reading, math, absenteeism, healthcare, the safety of our neighborhoods, and parents' access to childcare, which is, of course, essential for their ability to work. People who are evicted or filed against also are often forced to use predatory payday lenders or rely on credit cards to make ends meet. Matthew Desmond, who's the Pulitzer Prize winning author of Evicted, and I highly encourage everyone to read that if they have not already. He says it very eloquently: eviction is a cause, not just a condition of poverty. So eviction makes an already challenging situation worse, and can actually increase households' experience and level of poverty.
I think that's all well said. And I'll just add too that there's also like the mental harm that it causes of, you know, evictions is a trauma. And it's disturbing to me, the trauma that we're having on our kids, going through this type of instability and displacement. And it's a harm that's felt not just individual household, but as Cinta said, like across a community.
Thank you guys for all that. And it's a, you know, it is a sad situation when someone has been removed from the home for whatever reason. And people doubling up with families. There's people sleeping in their cars, people who are who live in hotels now is a norm, which is, you know, unfortunate. But let me go to the next question as we talk about um, what has changed in eviction intervention efforts since the pandemic? And the protections have ended. So I'll give that one to Center and Jordan, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I can start with that. So just a reminder, during the pandemic, um, uh, tenants, when they received the pay or quit notice, which is the first step in a formal eviction, they had 14 days in order to make their payment before they moved on to the next phase of the process, which is an unlawful detainer and the formal involvement of our state courts. That protection went away, and we are back to the pre-pandemic baseline of 5 days to make a payment or leave the property. And of course, no one receives it. You know, most of the people experiencing an eviction have a job, but paychecks don't come every 5 days. They typically come every 2 weeks. There were also twice as many legal aid attorneys during the pandemic, so allowing many more tenants access to legal representation and legal advice. And of course, we had the rent relief program, which had over $1 billion of funding available to pay landlords to keep landlords financially whole and individuals and their families safely housed through the public health crisis. So as those protections and resources went away, we did, as Laura showed, we saw the number of filings and evictions increase. Today, across the country, nationally, filings are at or above pre-pandemic levels in many areas. However, in Virginia, our statewide average is still around 80 to 85% of our pre-pandemic levels. So while our filing rates are still significantly higher than the rest of the country, with, as Laura showed, you know, over 13% of renters across the state experiencing an eviction or having a filing on their record. And of course, some of the highest rates being in the Hampton Roads area. But we're still, you know, higher than the rest of the country, but have experienced a decrease at a statewide level. I think another really important factor that we have to talk about as we message kind of the root cause of evictions is the math problem, right? So median rents since the pandemic statewide have increased by more than 15%. And renters' incomes have increased a little less than 4%. So it's just a math problem, right? And in Virginia, you would need to work if you earned minimum wage and were paying for a 2-bedroom market rate apartment, which is most renters, right, with kids. You would have to work something like close to 80 hours a week in order to afford that market rate rent. And just to bring it back to the whole picture of people's lives, you know, I'm a mom. If I was working 80 hours a week, I don't know when I'd be reading to my children, helping them with homework, preparing healthy meals for them, tending to their well-being in all the ways that we know parents want to do. So those are, I think, the biggest differences or what has changed since those protections ended. Jordan, do you want to speak more to that?
Yeah, I think you really laid out the baseline of it really well, which is that in essence, the safety net has decreased and the need has increased, right? So there's this mismatch of we really have less resources than we have during the pandemic and less protections while having the same problem, and what we're seeing is an increase as well. So, and with those rent increases and wages, you know, coming up, but slowly, more slowly than rent increases are happening. And that's because we have crazy low vacancy rates in pretty much every city in our area, especially in Hampton Roads, right? Like if there's another tenant waiting for that unit almost every time. And so there's going to be this natural desire to keep pushing the market until it breaks, right? And so with that, those pandemic protections and resources kind of coming to an end, right, as we were also experiencing this increase, we've just, again, created a math problem for ourselves and also a math problem for people's lives, right? Which is that, and we say it a lot around here, like I can teach you how to rip a $10 bill, but it doesn't make it 20, right? Like that's that resource of wages and those cost of living increases. Rent doesn't just freeze when your car payment goes up, which we've seen crazy increases in car payment, car insurance rates, lots of other life expenses, right? But everything is increasing for a lot of our families, and a lot of the people that we're working with for eviction prevention are people who were already on the brink, right? These are folks that did not have a lot of margin. And so when we take away the kind of pandemic era protections, but also the pandemic era resources, what we did is that we were kind of artificially propping up folks who were really struggling, and not artificially, but we were propping them up with real resources. But we removed that kind of influx, that large influx at the same time where people's needs were increasing or remaining the same. And so we just created an even bigger imbalance between the need and the resource there. And so, and like Cinta was saying, some of those pandemic era the protections were kind of common sense, right? Like the 14-day pay quit is one that I love because it's like the paycheck doesn't come in 5 days. You have no chance that like a 5-day pay quit is largely a formality in the filing process, right? But if it's a 14-day pay quit, we've actually maybe opened up some time for you to get a paycheck, to talk to family, to access resources from an assistance program like we run, right? Like you've given a significant lead time, and 14-day pay quit is the first step. And so then the filing is delayed, right? We're buying time along the way. And it's a challenge for landlords. It's a challenge for tenants as well. But it's something that makes sense in terms of how life actually works and how renting actually works. And so when those things go away, we didn't affect how life actually works. We just affected the things that were helping people with how life actually works and how renting actually works.
Well, Jordan, can you talk a little bit about what you're doing at 4Kids?
Yeah, absolutely. So I get to work with the wonderful Cinta Leslie at the state of Virginia, but we have the Virginia Eviction Reduction Pilot was stood up kind of around that same time as we were exiting the pandemic and we were starting to see some of these resources that had a sunset. There was a movement in the legislature to set up a pilot program, which we have subscribed to on VERP 3.0. And so we're the third round, and we get to say that we got to learn a lot from 1 and 2, but weren't part of those. So we have a lot of great partners around the state and a lot of great programs who are doing very similar things to us and have been doing it longer. So we're kind of the new kid on the block, but we try to be really innovative at 4Kids in general. And so part of that is just taking the resources to the people. And so one of our big interventions is that like that life, like we were just talking about, that life keeps happening, but it's happening in your space. And so that means that if we're saying, hey, you need to come here, you need to go to this office, you need to do these things, we're actually probably not meeting you in those resource spots that you need. So we go straight to the complexes. We take eviction prevention resources, we talk with landlords, we partner with high evicting landlords in our area because that is publicly available with RVA Eviction Lab, and that they've been really great partners. But we do financial management, we do case management, we talk about what are your protections? I know we're going to talk about fair housing in a bit, right? So what are the protections that you have as a renter? What are the responsibilities that you have as a renter? And what can and can't get you in trouble? And so we've got a lot of folks who are either first-time renters or have consistently rented, but are still struggling with the changes in law, the changes in responsibilities. So we try and lay that out for them and also connect them to resources like our wonderful legal aid in the area or other protections that we have because we know we can't do it alone. But at 4Kids, we really offer financial assistance for folks so that kind of, as Laura was saying, that 1.5 months is definitely what we see, right? That kind of 1,800 to 2,100 is like kind of the sweet spot for our program. And we find that that's what most people need and are able. What we also find, and this is a little off topic, but is that people have some or like half of that money, but they know that if they pay it, they're still going to get evicted, right? So I might as well keep that money and wait for the hotel, right? I'm still going to be evicted, so I'm going to keep it, or I'm going to try and make some more on it before I make a lump sum. But I'm already getting my late fee. I've already gotten charged the attorney fee. I've already gotten charged all the fees that I can. So I might as well sit on this money until I can actually pay it off to avoid and get dismissed, right? So one of the things our program is able to do is say, hey, if you make that payment, we can match, we can work with you and really make you whole and make the landlord whole, but also bring you to a spot where we're not in this cycle again next month because you've held on to that money because it wasn't enough. So I think that's one thing we really try and talk to our property management and landlord partners is like, hey, help us help you by letting your tenants and allowing your tenants to make partial payments or do some things and help us come alongside them. And we've had some really good success with that in our area, which is that we're not on either side. We just want to see people stay in their homes, right? And to be honest, as a citizen of Norfolk and a renter in Norfolk, I want to see my neighbors in their house, right? I do this because the people in my neighborhood are important to me, and the people that we serve at 4Kids are important to 4Kids and to all of us. But the reality is they're the kids in our kids' schools, they're the people in the library that we walk by, the people in the grocery store. We can't get around this issue, so we might as well be a part of the solution. So that's what we're doing at 4Kids. I know I went all over the place there. That tends to be a theme of
No,
mine.
that was great. That was great. We need more of that. I know this is probably still in pilot phase, but definitely need to see more of that. And Senta and Jordan, what does research show us about what intervention strategies work and what doesn't work?
So on a really macro level, I just want to underscore the math problem, right? So the root cause of this is that we do not have anywhere near the amount of affordable rental housing that's needed in order for people making honestly, anything less than like $55,000 a year to afford a market rate rent in Virginia. There's also the issue of legal representation. So in Virginia, only 2 tenants out of every 1,000 have an attorney when they go to court. So increasing access to free or low cost legal representation and advice is also critical in reducing the harm and the impact of evictions. Also, expungements. This is also falls into that macro category. Actually, a new policy passed this just this last session that when a case is dismissed or non-suited, the case is expunged automatically. So that's a real reduction to the harm caused by filings that don't actually, some of the filings that don't actually lead to a full executed writ of eviction. On a more micro scale or a household by household scale, providing flexible financial assistance is essential. And as Jordan and Laura have both said, typically there's an external event like a car repair or a sick child when you work a job that doesn't have paid leave. Something like that can, throw a household off in a very short amount of time when you live that close to the margin. So financial assistance that might help that, typically in the VERP program, it helps with rent, but it's also possible to use that. There's a lot of I used to be a single mom, and there were times where I was balancing my mortgage payment and my childcare payment and playing grace periods off of each other. So really, really far upstream preventatively, you might have a household that has managed to stay up on their rent, but now they're a month behind on their childcare. And if they can't take their kid to childcare anymore, they won't be able to work, and there goes, their housing stability. But in addition to financial assistance, and the VERP program is very different from the rent relief program. I used to refer to the rent relief program as the world's largest Band-Aid. It kept people housed, but it wasn't solving a systemic issue. We try to do a lot more of that with the VERP program. And one really important part of that is court navigation services, which provide tenants with time, information, and resources necessary to either slow down the incredibly and notoriously fast process of an eviction. And potentially give them the resources they need in order to stay where they are. But it could also help their transition to their next housing situation be a bit more humane. Our vision for our pilot is that evictions in Virginia will one day become rare. And when they can't be prevented, that the experience will be humane and the impact brief, which is really different from how it looks right now. And then I would also I really want to focus on using data for proactive outreach. We implore our grantees, and 4Kids does a tremendous job of this. But we really want our grantees to find the people who need help before the people who need help have to find them. And I do just want to give a shout out to landlords, which I know doesn't happen that often. But statistically, most landlords file for eviction rarely or not at all. It's a relatively short list of landlords who are using software systems and algorithms to kick out pay or quit notices on the 5th of the month and unlawful detainers on the 6th of the month. One of the things that 4Kids has done is use the data now available to identify the top 10 highest evicting landlords in the 2 cities that their pilot is operating in, and building relationships with those landlords, understanding, how this is benefiting their business model, and what can be done. And that's just one example. Our grantees across the state have been very creative in that category, but those are the interventions that we see having a huge difference, making a big difference in systems and regions across Virginia.
Did you want to add something to that, Jordan?
Yeah, I think just super briefly, I think what we find in the VERP program and our experiences as 4Kids is that one size fits all solutions are not really the answer, right? So when we try and fit everyone into a category of, do you owe rent? Do you have this? Do you make this amount? Do you, when we have all these qualifications that we typically have with programming, that can be really challenging to solve any kind of a systemic issue that has people at the focus, right? And so what we try and do, and what the VERT program, the way that it's written and the leadership of Cinta and her team, is that we can be really broad, but also really specific on a case-by-case basis, right? So what are the true reasons? Like we said, what are those kind of temporary one-time, two-time expenses that have caused you to lose the ability to pay your rent this month, right? And really kind of get down to even the nitty-gritty level of people's budgets. We talk about side hustles. We talk about, how can the 2 kids that you watch down the street, on Tuesdays, every Tuesday, how can you get a little bit of extra money for that, right? What are the ways that you can use your life circumstances to make this rent burden work, while also, creating a community around you and a what we would call a safety web, right? That when you fall, you don't fall as far. And so the case by case, but also something that we don't always see that the VERP program has is more generous income limits, right? So that is, I think, when we have up to 80% with VERP, which is very uncommon for assistance programming. A lot of times you see kind of 30% or 50% AMI. There are a lot of folks, our program really breaks down to about a third, and a third. People who are extremely low income, people who are moderately low income, and then people who we would still say are low income, but they're in the 50 to 80%. And those 50 to 80% are usually kind of left out of assistance programming for any type of rental assistance or any kind of food assistance. TANF, SNAP, any of those benefits, they're typically cut out. And so the reality of flexible funding for assistance is what works. The inflexible kind of, you have to do 18 forms and do this, that, and the third to get assistance on your rent, doesn't match up with the timeline of eviction, number one, but it also doesn't match up with the needs of the tenants, of the single older adults, of the, our average size is like three people household, primarily disproportionately Black female head of household, right? Like we need to meet people where they are and on the timeline that they're at to be able to effectively and realistically solve their tenancy issue, but also create a pathway out of that poverty for them or out of that situation. Like if RRP was a Band-Aid, we want to be a splint, right? We want to set that broken piece up for healing in the future. And most people really and truly like are just experiencing a temporary situation, so we need to treat it like that. We don't have to have a 9-month intervention for someone who needs a 9-day intervention. And so that's what we do. I've got an incredible team. I'll shout them out if I don't know if they're watching, but Tiffany and Audrey and Yolanda and Shirley, like we are a team that moves quickly, moves flexibly, and really shouts out the needs of our participants and cries from the rooftops every time we get a chance to be on something like this. So, but yeah, that's what we found that works is people focused, intermittent, and not one size fits all solutions.
Thank you, Jordan. And also another population that certainly we're seeing an increase of eviction are our elderly population. So I want to, my next question is, Laura, can you sort of tie in what are the fair housing implications of evictions?
Sure. Yeah, I touched on this a little bit in my slides earlier, but we see a huge disparate impact on racial minorities and children. Families with children as a protected class under our fair housing laws, as well as based on race and elderliness, all populations that are experiencing evictions at a disproportionately higher rate. But I think understanding how we got here is also important understanding of our way out of it. We've had discriminatory housing laws on the books, and even after they were explicitly banned, policymakers found other ways to continue to keep our community segregated and restrict housing choice. We see this overlap with, formerly red line neighborhoods where it was difficult for, Black families to be able to qualify for a mortgage or get homeowners insurance or even get ability to buy a house in the first place due to racial covenants that might be there. Those areas where they could buy that were considered riskier are also neighborhoods where we see the highest rates of evictions in our modern day context. So there's a direct through line to housing discrimination of the past to the eviction rates that we're seeing today. And that plays out with our zoning laws. It has made it difficult to build the supply of affordable housing that we need to really meet the demand, not just affordable housing, but just housing across the board. And when there's not enough housing, the overall cost of housing goes up. And in those formerly red line neighborhoods where we see the vast majority of our evictions, as Cinta said, those evictions are concentrated among a small number of landlords. Even in census tracts that have overall high eviction rates, it's a small set of those landlords who displace a large number of tenants year after year. They're landlords who have automated processes that as soon as that tenant is late, they're assessing a late fee. At the end of that 5-day para-quit period, they're automatically sending notice to their attorney to file that eviction case. We've seen a troubling pattern of large investment companies buying up properties in low income and historically Black neighborhoods around the state. If you're just looking at who the plaintiff is, i.e. the landlord in eviction filing, that might not tell the whole story. But the RBA Eviction Lab has a really great resource that tries to find common ownership among these buildings to show that it is, you might have several buildings of the high evictors that are in hand of one company. There was an interesting case in Maryland against properties that I think got a lot of attention because they were managed by Jared Kushner and connected to his family. It was one of the claims was a fair housing claim showing that they were purposely buying up multifamily properties in Black neighborhoods around Baltimore. They were increasing the rent, assessing additional fees for things like, you know, property maintenance fees that the landlord is supposed to be responsible for under the law anyways. We're not being responsive to requests for repairs. And we're using an evictions as part of a rent collection method as part of their business model. And it begs the question of, well, why are you targeting these particular neighborhoods, communities? I think anecdotally, we've seen something similar in Virginia, and it's, I think, worth examining further of, is this an outright fair housing violations? Either way, we certainly see the implications of that and who is getting evicted and the harms that follow those families. We've talked about the barriers that evictions pose to housing. So, Black families in Virginia already face barriers due to disparate share of incarceration rates, and a lot of landlords screen out people who have a criminal record, regardless of how long ago the offense was or what the offense was. I've seen people denied housing because of, simple marijuana possession from 30 years ago. That has no bearing whether or not they're going to be a good tenant today. Add on top of that, you have landlords denying someone because of an eviction filing, let alone eviction judgment. Those barriers to housing for Black families is much higher. And it also has a disparate impact on their total housing cost. So outside of just the amount of rent that someone is paying proportionate to their income, evictions increase your housing costs, because if you're unstable, you might have to be paying that late fee every single month. Or if you're getting sued by your landlord every month, you're also paying those court costs and attorney's fees. And it really creates a snowball effect that you end up paying probably twice as much in rent as someone who is more stably housed, just because of those additional costs of trying to get caught up. And so, big picture, legacy of segregation and concentrations of poverty in our state, and this is reflected in a lot of cities across the country, but also in the immediate term, we're seeing these particular predatory practices in formerly red line neighborhoods. And so that begs the question of how do we get out of it? Like, what more data do we need to go after these type of practices? One of the challenges, even though the RV Eviction Lab has been doing a great job trying to get to this common ownership, it's also difficult to find that sometimes, because oftentimes it's held in an LLC, and finding who behind the LLC can be really challenging, as well as seeing tracing where they're buying up properties to see if there is some kind of pattern, a racially discriminatory pattern.
Well, I would say it may be difficult, but not impossible. So
Right.
that's something that we need to work on, right? And I know sent a little, well, a couple of things you said. You talked about zoning, which is another conversation altogether, which we certainly need more information on and more conversation. What policymakers are doing now to address evictions? I know, Santa, you mentioned, we were talking about, but talk about, if you can share what other things policymakers are doing. And then after that, so we can kind of flow into the next question, is what else can policymakers do?
Well, I might let Laura speak to this in a little bit more detail, but I do have some good news. The budget was passed and signed out of the General Assembly and the Governor's office, and it included a modest increase to the VERT program, an increase of $150,000 each year of the biennium. And that may allow us to bring on a new grantee or support more households among the grantees who are already doing this really good work. And we're so grateful to the General Assembly and Governor Youngkin for allowing us to continue our pilot. I'll just, before I kick it over to maybe Laura, someone who will speak more directly to policy. In terms of what we can do just all collectively, I really want a shift in the framework of who's experiencing eviction. And I think when we understand that you are never more likely to face an eviction than when you are a child, can really bring like that having that be a more widely understood and known element of this crisis could bring a lot more people into the fold. So if you care about education, if that's your issue, homework starts with home. We can't expect our kids to do well in school if they don't have a reliable and safe roof over their head. So I can't speak to very many policies specifically, and I'll let Laura do that if time permits. But I would encourage everyone to shift the frame. In most cases, it's working parents who have more than one child. So the majority of people experiencing this crisis are kids. Our kids are most vulnerable of experiencing an eviction, and that can change.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we talked about is an understanding that evictions are a policy choice. You don't get to the level of evictions we have here in Virginia just by a few people merely from lack of personal responsibility. The data shows that it's a much more systemic problem, and one that our policymakers can, because we've done it before during the pandemic, and should fix. We're very fortunate that Virginia has a new slate of legislators who care about housing, many of whom have experienced housing instability themselves and have a deep understanding of the harms and challenges that our families are facing, are committed to making sure that evictions are rare in our state and that Virginia is no longer an attractive place for investment companies to come and use this as a business practice and harm our families in the state. So what are we doing? I think that policy interventions that we've seen so far can be put into 4 major buckets. One has to do with addressing the court process for evictions. Virginia, compared to other states, they're cheap to file and they're fast. Filing fees are about $56, varies a little bit by jurisdiction, compared to places like Alabama that they're average about $230. So it should not be surprising to learn that Alabama, despite having deeper poverty, has much lower eviction filings, probably because of the cost. And evictions in Virginia happen very fast. We talked a little bit about that pay or quit period, which is the time between, when that tenant gets a notice saying, by the way, you're late on rent, and before that landlord can file an eviction case is only 5 days. There is, effort this year to bring us back to that 14-day pay or quit period that we had during the pandemic. That unfortunately the governor vetoed that bill, but I anticipate that we'll continue to see that come back to make sure that our families have enough time to get that second paycheck or get assistance before they have that eviction filing, which just adds to their cost. In addition to fixing that court process and protecting the due process rights of tenants, I think a lot of people have this idea of court as what we see in TV, where it's this adversarial system where each side has an attorney, they're duking it out. But if anyone's been to eviction courts, they know that's not how it plays out in Virginia. Cinta mentioned that tenants have legal representation in like less than 1% of cases. I encourage you, if you haven't been, to go to General District Court to see these dockets. Oftentimes these cases happen in 1 minute or less, maybe a little bit longer if the tenant has an attorney, but they happen very quickly. It's more of just a routine rubber stamping process that happens. One way that we can make this process fair, and something that the legislature passed and the governor signed, is to clarify the process about, if a landlord is going to be asking for more rent, by the time they get to court, of what is the correct process for asking for more money. Right now, the landlord just checks a box on that summons, so it'll tell the tenant, here's how much you're being sued for. But otherwise, there's just a checkbox. They don't necessarily know how much they're ultimately going to have to pay by the time they get to court in order to stop the eviction from happening. This bill requires a landlord to provide better notice of what those additional amounts may be, which helps the tenant make a more informed decision. As Jordan mentioned, if you only have some cash, like maybe it's better that I save that to pay for a hotel or for the new place, or if I know that I can get assistance for that additional amount, then maybe I can stop the eviction from happening. That's one that they worked on. Other things they could work on is, making sure that every tenant has legal representation in an eviction case. I know that there's a few localities that have been looking at pilots for this. Richmond is possibly going to have additional money to hire more attorneys, and I know Fairfax has looked at this. And it is something that VERP grantees could be using some of their VERP money for, is to pay for more attorneys to represent tenants in eviction cases. The other bucket of policies is around enhanced consumer protections. One of the ways that we have been seeing people's housing costs go up are the additional junk fees that are getting added to leases. Someone, when they're trying to figure out where is a place that's affordable I can live, they might see, rent advertised for $1,200 a month. But once you get into that lease and see like, oh, now you're responsible for a trash concierge fee, a pest control fee, a fee to hold your packages at the rental office, those add up very quickly. I was looking at a lease for one of the legislative assistants at the GA this year, and once you added all those fees, her actual monthly rent was $400 more than what it said on the first page of her lease and what she had budgeted for. So one of the efforts this year was just to create more transparency in those fees, to make sure that they're all listed on the front page of the lease, and others to ensure that we're not charging tenants for things that is the landlord's responsibility, such as maintenance of the property. Some of those had some amendments that the General Assembly rejected. We're waiting to see what's going to happen from the governor. But even if the governor ultimately vetoes it, I know there'll be efforts again next year to really get a hold on these junk fees and making sure that we're not gouging out our families with these additional unnecessary costs. The other bucket of policies is, removing those barriers to accessing housing through a few different reforms, mainly around these tenant screening policies. We saw and are thankful to see the governor sign the expungement bill. So if starting July 1 of this year, if someone has an eviction case that is dismissed or non-suited, that case is automatically expunged. It means that it should not be showing up on any tenant screening report or on the online court record system. One caveat to that is if someone has an eviction filing or non-suit that was entered prior to July 1 of this year, they would have to go through that petition process. And I believe the Legal Aid Society of Eastern Virginia has some kind of program that they've been setting up to help people navigate that. I think particularly if you have a bunch of filings, it can be kind of confusing to remember like when those happened and what court it was, and they should be able to help you with filling out that form and getting it submitted to the court. So if you have anything prior to July 1 this year, make sure to reach out to them for some assistance. In addition to that, the harms that we see from having an eviction filing on your record, it's also just creating some transparency in the process in general. We have a program that helps folks who have a housing choice voucher with the Richmond Redevelopment Housing Authority. And we've seen this a lot where someone is applying to 8-10 places, paying that $50 application fee every time, only to get denied, often without being told the reason for the denial. A lot of landlords are turning to these third-party tenant screening companies to make these risk assessments of whether or not to rent to the tenant. So they're pulling all their court data, they're pulling their credit report, they're pulling, any criminal history to make that determination. But they are not disclosing up front what those minimum criteria are. So this bill would have required the landlord to say, like, what's your basic criteria? What are things that are going to result in automatic denial of a tenant? And then when you deny someone, give them a reason for the denial. If it's because they have an eviction or if because their credit score, tell them that. Unfortunately, there's a lot of errors that we see in these third-party tenant screening reports, and it's hard to fix those if you don't know that that's the basis of your denial. I know there's also been efforts at the federal level to deal with those errors and the type of notice they give people. So that's a bill that had some bipartisan support, and the governor has suggested some amendments that the General Assembly rejected. We're still waiting to hear if the governor is going to ultimately veto the bill or let it become law. He has until May 17th to do so. So stay tuned. Another related to that Senate screening has to do with criminal record screening. I've mentioned that we have the disparities in incarceration rates in Virginia that affect people's ability to gain housing. So this bill would apply to our affordable housing providers to make sure that they're implementing a screening process that is fair, that they're only denying people if they have a conviction that goes to whether or not they're going to be a good tenant. There was a survey done of some of the affordable housing providers across the state, and they were screening out for offenses that are associated with being homeless, such as loitering and trespassing, regardless of the age of the offense. So if we're really serious about solving our homelessness problem and making sure that people are able to exit out of homelessness, we can't be screening out people for offenses they had while they were homeless. Unfortunately, the governor vetoed that bill. But if you're a housing provider, the Virginia Fair Housing Office has guidance on what a good criminal record screening policy is to make sure that as you're implementing that you're not violating the Fair Housing Act in your policies. And the last bucket is around holding landlords accountable for not upkeeping their properties. We've talked about those additional costs for housing. Well, living in housing with bad conditions also increase the cost, particularly in a place like Norfolk, where you have frequent storms and hurricanes and a lot of mold exposure. Children in particular are vulnerable to having developing asthma due to mold exposure in the home. And if you have a landlord that's not being responsive to that or mediating it, it can mean more trips to the doctor, more trips to the emergency room, missing school because of those conditions. And that's just one example. The landlords that we see being some of the highest evictors are also oftentimes responsible for code violations from the city and not being responsive to fixing the conditions of the home. So there's a few efforts to really address that. One, which would have made it easier for tenants to take their landlord to court for failing to make those repairs. Unfortunately, the governor vetoed that one. And the other one would give localities more authority to go after slumlords. But those really bad actors that repeatedly don't fix those basic health and safety things. I believe that's one that we're still waiting that the governor has until May 17th to make a final determination on what he's doing with those bills. But again, even if he ultimately vetoes it, I know the patrons, my understanding is committed to continue to bring this back so that localities can make sure that they have a community that is safe and healthy to live in. And I mentioned 4 buckets, but the last one I have is just funding. Funding for building more affordable housing, for eviction intervention efforts. We know a lot of our eviction problems are systemic and take big fixes, but we also need interventions in the meantime to people experience crisis now to make sure that it doesn't create a snowball effect and that people are able to be stabilized in their housing.
Wow, Laura, we have a lot of work to do, right? Oh my gosh. Um, Thank you all so much for your contribution and sharing data and what might work, what doesn't work, what can work. We want to open it up. I think that Elizabeth, she's manning the questions. If we could get started on those to hear from the participants.
Thanks, Regina. So we had a few questions that were answered by our panelists. So those have been answered as they were going through. So most of those are there already, but we have one still here. Do we see that although filings are higher in places like Norfolk than, say, Newport News, but the judgment is lower due to organizations that are able to help people in Norfolk than Newport News that may not have housing support? Don't know who might be able to.
Probably
address that.
Jordan.
Yeah,
Maybe.
I can take a shot at that one. I would definitely don't have the full answer to this, but at 4Kids, we also are a partner in running and primarily run the housing crisis hotline for the area. So we get calls from 13 localities. We get about 70,000 calls a year. It's a huge volume. And so we've got full-time staff that do that. But I can tell you that resources are extremely stretched in every locality. And so I think part of that question, and so specifically to talk to the peninsula with Newport News, we got a really great VERP grantee up there, United Way of Virginia Peninsula, and Charvela and Jen and her team, and Thrive, I know, is a big partner up there as well. Like, they do a great job. But I think part of it is that the localities treat the court process a little differently, but also that there are some resources in Norfolk, but I can tell you definitely not enough. But I think it's just it's a little bit of a difference pre and post pandemic there, but there's huge filing rates in both. So I don't know if that super answers that question, but the court process is slightly different. I've sat in both of those courts. And so the scheduling practice and a couple other things are a little different, but increasingly, like Laura spoke to, like, the court reform piece of this is such a huge, like, it's one of the things that I didn't know that I would become such a soapbox guy about. But the reality of court is that it's largely a rubber stamp, but it's also just a formality in the process of a possession or of a dismissal. Like, a lot of times it's already dismissed or it's already in possession by the time you get to court. Like, the outcome is largely already predetermined. And what we see, especially in our area with Chesapeake and Portsmouth and in Norfolk courts, I know it's very similar, is that high evicting landlords and attorney represented cases are often segmented to one day of the week. Or 2 days of the week, and it's like a roll call, right? So if you live in these 6 complexes, go into the hallway, talk to the landlord's attorney, see if you can work something out. If you can't, come back in, but no one ever comes back in because they don't know that they can. It's really you're set up for failure in those processes, and largely you really don't have any outcome that's going to work positively for you if you're there. And so it's Melissa and her team at Legal Aid. I think she was on here earlier. Legal Aid Southeastern Virginia, huge shout out. They're incredible. That 2% representation rate, their service area is all the way up on the peninsula as well. So the 2% is just really, really hardworking legal aid attorneys often, who are stretched so thin it's impossible. Like, it's like a cheese paper level of stretch for them. But like, it's just such an intense need there that the court reform piece is so necessary if we're going to do anything about this. We got to make it a fairer, more complete process.
I would just add to that.
Absolutely. Oh gosh, go ahead, Santa.
It very well could be that the great work our grantees are doing in the 2 communities mentioned, Norfolk versus Newport News, is part of that picture. But just a reminder that everywhere the filing number is significantly higher than the number of cases that actually move all the way through the executed writ of eviction. So for most people, when they get that pay or quit or the unlawful detainer, they don't show up to court. Evictions have some of the highest rates of no-shows in civil courts. I think for the reasons that Jordan, the people have a sense that nothing good is going to come of appearing for their court case, in which case a landlord is granted automatic possession. So when we see that difference between the number of filings versus the number of writs, the difference isn't necessarily telling a positive story, right? And what chances are that family knows they didn't have the money, didn't have faith in the court process, and they've moved on themselves, but will continue to have that filing on their record and face the barriers we talked about at the top of this conversation.
I think there's
Well,
also some,
go ahead. Mhm.
sorry, I think it's also evidence of like successful policy interventions. One, in 2019, after there's, Matthew Desmond's book Evicted, but also the New York Times article that really highlighted Virginia for having some of the top evicting cities across the country. The General Assembly, took that seriously and instituted a number of policy interventions aimed at curbing that. One is clarifying, strengthening what's called the right of redemption. And this is what allows a tenant that even after they've been sued for an eviction, if they can pay everything they owe, which at that point is likely to include court costs and attorney's fees, any rent that has accrued, they can pay and stay. So pay off what they owe to stop the eviction. And part of what has made that new right accessible and possible is because of both the rent relief program and the VERT program, that there is actually financial assistance out there to assist those families and be able to exercise that right of redemption. Jordan talked about, you might have a family that, sure, they might have like $800, but that alone is not going to stop the eviction. But by connecting with, a VERT program to meet the remainder, $400, whatever it is, to stop the eviction, that is a meaningful policy change that we can't stop having VERT funding now just because we've seen a drop in actual judgments. I think it's because of VERT and that right of redemption that we've seen a decrease. And I think specifically to part of how legal aid in Norfolk works is they actually have not just attorneys, but also partnering with folks who are out in the community to help make that connection, to where if they see, a report of like upcoming evictions, they can do outreach to those communities to make sure that they're able to connect with legal assistance. And there are certain landlord attorneys out there that are representing these large filers that as soon as they see a legal aid attorney on the other side, they drop the case and don't move forward with the eviction. So those are meaningful things that we've been doing and that we just need to increase to really continue not just reducing number of eviction judgments, but ultimately want to see a drop in eviction filings.
Yeah,
Well, we have so much work to do, but go ahead, Jordan.
Yeah, I was just trying to
Read
read through the question and make sure I was hitting the point. But like, I think a little bit of it is that the judgment amount might be lower, or that there might be lower judgments because there might be more frequent filings, right? There might be, like Laura spoke about in her slide deck, right? So that $1,229 base rent, $1,800 as a rent, so like as an amount owed. So if you're filing consistently and you're filing all the time, you are likely going to have a lower judgment principal versus, like she was saying, with Northern Virginia, or maybe what we're seeing with Newport News a little bit, right? Like that, if you're delaying filing, you probably have a larger principal, but less filing. So there's kind of a give and take there, both bad, but it's not like one side is great and one side is not great, but we definitely want less filings. But I mean, I think I pulled the numbers last week for May through the Legal Services Corporation, which kind of is the head organization for legal aids all across the country. And it was like, there's like 3,300 filings in May for Hampton Roads. I mean, that's like 3,300 of our neighbors, like that's what we got to remember in that process is those people live beside us. Like it's not them, it's us. But
Yes, absolutely. Not them, but us. I want to, Elizabeth, do you have any others? Because if not, we'll start closing out.
There are no more in the Q&A. I'll just give it one more chance. If you would prefer to raise your virtual hand in the Zoom, we are able to give you the chance to say your question aloud if anyone has that. And I will call out, there were a couple questions about the eviction, having an eviction removed, and Laura touched on that and mentioned the legal aid. So I've dropped in the chat
Mhm.
legal aid's eviction expungement project. So there's a link there as well. Other questions included whether or not we would send the slides and the recording, and yes, we are. So look for your emails for the recording and slides. And
Were you
Yeah.
able to get the evaluation in the chat or Q&A?
yes, we also have,
Okay.
we'll ask folks if you can tell us how we did on this webinar and share your thoughts. We have put a link in the chat, and I will share a QR code as well on the screen. But at the moment, there are still no hands raised.
Okay, well, I want to, just in
Oh.
case, someone is
Oh, we
waiting.
do
Do you have someone?
I do have someone. Hold on, I gotta find them.
Okay.
Still new to figuring out this particular function. Oh, Teresa, you should be able to speak now, Teresa.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for all this information. I had a question in regards to I've come across clients who have say due to some issues when they are paying their rent and paid by check, and then something happened where um their check basically didn't go through. So they were charged a $50 um fee, a fee from the bank, a fee from their renter's office. But then after say two, they could no longer pay by check. So now they either have to pay by debit, which adds another cost onto that the rent, or if they've paid using a credit card, then that's like another $50 increase. But how is there a way for them to avoid because they now can no longer pay by check. So they have to either do by debit or cashier's check. But those fees are just adding, additionally to the high rents that they already have.
Yeah, I can help answer this. The first step I always encourage people is make sure you have copies of your receipts to prove that you've made your rent payments. And I understand that money orders come with, additional charge to get those, but that is one way to guarantee that it's not going to have a bounce back. That's going to cost less than having a return charge from both your bank and your landlord. Now we have seen more landlords that will only accept online payments, which comes with a transaction fee. One of the efforts this year would have made that illegal, that you would have to provide some way of paying method that doesn't come with additional charge. That I don't remember the status of that legislation. That may have been one that the landlord vetoed, but that I think is going to require a policy change. I don't have individual advice to deal with that right now. But if you're continuing to see it, legislators need to hear from you to know that this is a problem for folks, that it is increasing their cost. But in the immediate term, I think a safer bet is to do the money order and make sure you keep a copy of that receipt. I've had clients who pay with money orders and then the landlord alleges they didn't receive all of it. Well, if you have that receipt from a money order, there's a number you can call to see if someone has cashed that in or not, to have a better way to track of like what happened to it. So that's my immediate answer. I don't know, Jordan, if you had anything to add.
Yeah, the receipts are the key. We have even started telling people, like, if you pay by money order, especially at a Dropbox, because we see a lot of rental offices that are closed pretty significant amounts of the week, right? So that's that limiting that in person, or won't accept anything other than through the Dropbox or through online payment. We've started telling people to take a video, and that was from legal aid partners, is like, take a video of yourself putting it in the Dropbox. One of our very first cases with Burp, which seems so long ago, but is not, was a person who had lived our complex for several, like, I think like 8 years, and always paid by money order, always in the Dropbox, had dropped it in the Dropbox. She had tracked it. Someone had cashed it in like another state. There was some fraud, some all kinds of stuff. Like, and the landlord was like, nope, I didn't get it. It didn't come into my account, so you're on the hook for it, right? Even though it was in their Dropbox. So legal aid was involved, and the judge still wouldn't accept that answer, right? Which I would have other challenges with that we can talk offline about. But like the reality is like you are the burden of proof is on you as the tenant, and you will lose that battle most times unless you have the paperwork, unless you have the video, unless you have the charge statement, whatever that looks like for you. Always encourage them, and then always connect them to legal aid. I mean, you got way more of a fighting chance if you can work with them on that, if there's some kind of false statement or some perceived falsity in a case. So definitely video, picture, receipt, have a friend with you, whatever it looks like, you know, some kind of accountability for the landlord, and have them write the receipt in front of you and give it to you. They should have a receipt book. They have to provide receipt legally, and they have to provide you a ledger if you request it. So always request updated ledgers, always request receipts, all those things.
Jordan, there's another
Thank you, Jill.
question in
Okay.
the Q&A that I think you can answer. What can you do to advocate for a client going through an eviction as a caseworker?
Yeah, so hard. I've been there on several sides of that challenge as a caseworker and a housing specialist, kind of navigating that with people, and then working with our case managers here and then with our team now. Number one, remember that you're working with a person, right? That is going to have strong feelings. They're going to be going through something that is one of the more challenging times of their moment. So that is going to come on you sometimes, right? You're going to get the end of that call, unfortunately. But while you're working with them through that, always encourage communication with the landlord. When you go silent with your landlord has to assume the worst. So include always be in communication. If you're going to be late, if you're going to try and pay, if you're going to make a payment plan, like always encourage that. Encourage them to come with solutions to their landlord. A landlord doesn't want to hear, I don't have my rent. They want to hear, I don't have my rent, but here's when I will have it. Or here's how much I'll have on this date. And on this date, I can do another 350. And then on this date, I can do another 250, and then we're back on track, right? So always come with dates, amounts. And then if you are in the unfortunate reality of this is just not going to work, start that safety plan early, connect them to community resources. If they're in this area, if ththey're in Hampton Roads, resources757.com is a great resource. There's a lot of those resources around the state. BPLC has a self-help eviction defense that they just launched, which is really great, and you can click through it. But yeah, remember they're a person. Remember that the landlord is also a person, and not often if you're in a property management office, like you're an employee of a landlord, and that you are not the enemy. You are just a person who works for like the other side of the case, and trying to keep those lines of communication early and not burn that bridge, because they will ultimately be the solution as well. If you go in and pop off at the rental office, it's not going to work out well. And so just try and be realistic, but also work on the safety plan, connect to family resources if they are going to lose that place, and start looking early if you know that this place is not going to work out, because you've got about 45 days realistically if you do lose that case. And if you lose the case, it's the 10 days after court appeal period. And then you get the sheriff's 72 hours somewhere in there, but 72-hour notice is a little bit of a misnomer because the sheriffs are backed up. So you probably have a little bit of time, but make that safety plan. That's the unfortunate reality of it. But yeah, I mean, and also shout out to you. If you're the caseworker, you're doing good work. Keep your head up. Been there, done that. You're going to make it. It's hard, but you're doing good stuff.
Thanks,
And I would
Jordan.
also add to that, any type of communication with the landlord and any negotiations, always back it up with a written communication, whether it's through a text, through an email, through a letter, a note, whatever. It just needs to be in writing to, to keep things above board, and so everybody understands what was said. Elizabeth, you said something?
Yeah, there's one more question, I think, for Senta probably. Has DHCD made awards for the supplemental VERP opportunity?
Not yet. We have made our recommendations, and we are awaiting final approval.
Thank you. All right, so
All
that
right, it's 11:30, and so I think we have to close out. I do want to thank certainly our panelists for your participation today and all your expertise and sharing. Thank you guys so much. We did have an in-person community conversation scheduled for Thursday in Norfolk, but that has been postponed. and we will reschedule that later. There is certainly a QR code on the screen there. If you can fill that out or just click that on, we'd love to hear from you. And I myself, certainly personally, am looking forward to continuing to work in the Hampton Roads community, going forward. So thank you all again so much. And thank you so much, Elizabeth. You were excellent as well, the tech person today. So good day, everyone.